Hello and welcome to today's LaRouche Manhattan Project town meeting entitled Precipice or Turning Point. Can a new security and development architecture replace NATO? As everybody knows, we are looking at a process which in one sense could be about to begin World War III. But the Schiller Institute has put out a petition, and today's program is essentially devoted to a discussion of that petition with two participants, Paul Gallagher and Gerry, who are joining me today for today's discussion. So we're going to first let you see the petition, which is called Convoke an International Conference to Establish a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations. This is something being circulated for signature by the Schiller Institute, but primarily for discussion by nations, institutions, and individuals. We want to give you a sense of the text of this petition. It says, behind this very real danger of war, and the cause of that danger, is the blowout of the entire transatlantic financial system. A nearly $2 quadrillion speculative bubble of derivatives and debt is already blowing apart. A hyperinflationary process has been unleashed globally with an accompanying collapse of the physical economies of the Western nations. The City of London and Wall Street, the owners of that bankrupt system, are desperate to destroy any functioning alternative to their system, such as Russia and China's alliance around the Belt and Road Initiative, which now incorporates nearly 150 nations, and the financial establishment has openly stated that this is what is at stake. So has Vladimir Putin, who has correctly said that the United States, United Kingdom, NATO, relentless expansion eastward, up to Russia's very borders, is driven by this economic policy, and that it threatens Russia's national security in ways Russia cannot accept. Therefore, to stop the drive to war, it is necessary to adopt a more fundamental approach, which is to establish an entirely new paradigm that will ensure the security and the economic development of every nation on the planet. The only recent precedent for this in the West is the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which put an end to 150 years of religious wars in Europe. It was crafted only at the point that all parties realized that if they continued on their current path, there would be no winners and very few survivors. They chose to create a new paradigm based on the defense of the interest of the other, and on the premise that the security of all was the first requirement for the security of each party. That is the key lesson of the Treaty of Westphalia for today. The world today stands at a similar crossroads. If the current geopolitical policies continue, nuclear war becomes a very real possibility, after which there would be no winners and most probably no survivors. We want to make clear to everyone who is watching and who is beginning to try to discuss and describe what they think is an event called the Ukraine-Russia conflict, is that we want to disabuse you of the arrogance of that delusion. No such thing is occurring. A process is underway, which has actually been underway for quite a bit of time. And it's a process that some forces have been warning about, such as this organization, for many decades. It's a process that involves a series of dynamic processes going back actually arguably centuries, but in specific, since the period of the collapse of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and promises that were made at the time about the NATO not expanding to the east. Now, last Monday, Vladimir Putin gave a speech in which which was called, of course, in the West, a rambling rant, mystical, and many other things. And true to form, media refused to report to the American or other people, for that matter, what he actually said. Part of what he talked about was his concern about the expansion of NATO eastward and what it had done to create a kind of compromise of Russia's security. We're going to now show you that he said the following: the information we have gives us good reason to believe that Ukraine's accession to NATO and the subsequent deployment of NATO facilities has already been decided and is only a matter of time. We clearly understand that given this scenario, the level of military threats to Russia will increase dramatically, several times over. And I would like to emphasize at this point that the risk of a sudden strike at our country will multiply. He's talking about a nuclear strike, by the way. I will explain that American strategic planning documents confirm the possibility of a so-called preemptive strike at enemy missile systems. We also know the main adversary of the United States and NATO, it is Russia. NATO documents officially declare our country to be the main threat to Euro-Atlantic security. Ukraine will serve as an advanced bridgehead for such a strike. If our ancestors heard about this, they would probably simply not believe this. We do not want to believe this today either, but it is what it is. I would like people in Russia and Ukraine to understand this. Many Ukrainian airfields are located not far from our borders. Finally, after the U.S. destroyed the INF Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Pentagon has been openly developing many land-based attack weapons, including ballistic missiles, that are capable of hitting targets at a distance of up to 5,500 kilometers. If deployed in Ukraine, such systems will be able to hit targets in Russia's entire European part. The flying time of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Moscow will be less than 35 minutes. Ballistic missiles from Kharkov will take 7 to 8 minutes, and hypersonic assault weapons 4 to 5 minutes. It is like a knife to the throat. I have no doubt that they hope to carry out these plans as they did many times in the past. Now, what's notable here is to understand that whether you wish to believe that the United States is trying to do that or not, or you wish to believe that NATO is trying to do that, Vladimir Putin believes it. And it's on his border that it is proposed that strategic missiles may be deployed with, for example, Ukraine talking about and discussing the potential of acquiring nuclear weapons again. Both Zelensky referenced this, and people from the Svoboda Party and other of the right-wing forces have been talking about this actually going back to 2014. This is exactly the circumstance that economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche sought to avoid by proposing and initiating a policy called the Strategic Defense Initiative that was in fact endorsed and adopted by the United States on March 23rd, 1983. In other words, what we're in right now is something that was actually obviated, that is to say, reversed 39 years ago. But because that policy was never implemented, because of the fact that people like George Bush in the Reagan-Bush administration and others went after this policy and went after Lyndon LaRouche, incarcerating him in the process, we are where we are today. That's the actual reason for what is going on, because had that policy been adopted and the corresponding economic development policies with that security policy, there would be no such thing as a group of nations having expanded in NATO from the 15, 16 nations of the 1989-91 period to the 30 nations today. Just to show it to you graphically, in 1949, NATO had 12 countries. If we have these slides, please. 1949, it had 12. Then during the period of 1989, it was up to about 15 and 16 nations. It was in this period that what was said was that NATO could not expand and should not expand 1 inch eastward. In just a moment, we'll reference this in terms of documentation that has recently been released. And by 2020, 2021, NATO was up to 30 countries. If we now pull up the last slide, we'll tell you where the projection is. That includes Ukraine. That's where we would have been going. What happened was that some days ago, well, of course, there's been a discussion over the course of the past several weeks about whether or not there was ever an actual promise that NATO forces would, in fact, not advance eastward. James Baker had been quoted as having said that to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990. Others had contended it, and then it had been said, well, it was never put in writing, was never actually discussed. But in fact, recently, a document appeared on the antiwar.com site which was stated, uncovered document revealed Soviet Union was promised no NATO expansion at the end of the Cold War. And what this document does is to go through the actual 1991 meetings in which such things were discussed. I want to just quote from that document, the same one that you're seeing up there right now. The document is the minutes of a meeting between foreign ministry officials from the United States, France, Germany, and Britain. So one official, who was a German diplomat, stated, quote, "We made it clear in the 2+4 negotiations that we would not expand NATO beyond the Elbe River in Germany. We can therefore not offer NATO membership to Poland and the others." This is all in the article that you're seeing on your screen. A second diplomat was an American, also recounted part of the story. What this was French, U.S., and British officials were discussing this with Germany. And so Raymond Seitz, who served as the United States Assistant Secretary of State for Canada and Europe at the time, said, quote, "We have made it clear to the Soviet Union in the 2+4 talks and elsewhere that we will not take advantage of the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Eastern Europe." The document, which has been previously classified, was discovered by Joshua Shifrinson, an international relations professor at Boston University. Now, there is an entirely different conception of security and development that had been offered by Lyndon LaRouche. And he offered it actually even at the time that he was at that point incarcerated. That was in 1989. Mr. LaRouche was put in jail on January 27th, 1989. Berlin Wall came down in November of that same year. And immediately subsequent to that, he began to develop policies, which we will be talking about in a moment. But before we do that, what we want to do is to indicate what the principles, the philosophical outlook has to be if we want to have something called an efficient world security and development architecture. You cannot talk about trying to bring together enemies from around the world unless there's a higher conception, higher principle that has to inform the form of agreement that policy is going to be used, is going to wield in order to be used. In other words, if you don't have a principle that from which you're starting, you can't formulate policy coming off it, because the content of policy is both the method by which it's made and therefore the principles upon which that method exists. Lyndon LaRouche discussed that in 2001 with respect to both Russia and the idea of a world community of economic development and progress based on a higher scientific conception of the human mind and the relationship of man to nature.
The great theory of the environment was established by a Russian of Ukrainian credentials, Vladimir Vernadsky, with his concept of geobiochemistry. See, what you're taught, the problem here is you're taught in most universities and elsewhere about science is nonsense. It's a damn lie, most of it, to put it frankly. What you're taught as basic physics is mostly a lie. Because we know from, as Vernadsky demonstrated this in his own way, and others have known it and shown it, that there are actually three principles involved in man's physical relationship to the earth and the universe. Three categories. One, the category we call non-living processes, what most people who aren't well educated call physical processes. Yeah? The second one, which some people don't understand, those in molecular biology, they refuse to understand it. It's called the principle of life. You will never get life out of a non-living process. Life is, as Pasteur insisted, is a principle unto itself. But how it's a universal physical principle, which, as Vernadsky demonstrated with his biogeochemistry, is that the history of Earth is what? The oceans and the atmosphere were produced by living processes. Down several kilometers in the Earth's surface, most of the Earth that we're in touch with as humanity was created as a byproduct of living processes. What Vernadsky calls the natural products of the biosphere. We can measure it. We can measure the power of the biosphere over the non-living process. We can measure it. Living processes are superior to non-living processes. They're more powerful. They're apparently weak, but their long-term effects are more powerful than the short-term effects of the non-living processes. Now there's a third thing, which again Kant won't let you know. Immanuel Kant. That's why they call him Kant, because he can't do anything. If you believe him, you can't do anything either. The essential nature of man is that we are capable of making discoveries of universal physical principle. Discoveries we can validate in known experimental ways. By applying these principles, we increase our power in the universe in ways that can be measured physically per capita and per square kilometer. We can measure this in terms of the demographic effect of this kind of action. That is, does the human species improve its life expectancy, its power to exist in the universe as a result of this? Yes, it does. That's good. Mankind actually is primary mastery of nature has occurred in terms of man's mastery and development of the biosphere. So actually the biosphere is including what we call basic economic infrastructure, such as waterways, power systems, transportation systems. These are the development of cities, of good cities at least. These are natural products of cognition which are reflected as improvements in the biosphere.
Okay, so here's the question for you. If Lyndon LaRouche was the person that formulated the Strategic Defense Initiative, this meaning laser defense, which essentially rendered nuclear warfare impotent and obsolete, if he's the person that did that and was able to convince Ronald Reagan of that, and that then became the policy of the United States, though it was never implemented, what does that have to do with what you just heard? In other words, what does the one thing that he did in the so-called military area have to do with what you just heard? And the answer is everything. Because there is no such thing as an efficient military policy that is not based on economic development. And that is why NATO can never work. That is why nothing that is being done, nothing that's being discussed with respect to the present realm or regime of negotiations, discussions, ceasefires, whatever you want to call it, UN deliberations, none of that can ever work. And if it doesn't work, which it will not, nuclear war is the only other option. Therefore, the time has now come to discard that entire way of thinking in favor of a method of thinking that will allow for durable survival. We just want to briefly now, in summarizing this section, give you a few ideas about some of the things that Lyndon LaRouche did in terms of his economic work, because he was not merely an economic forecaster. He wasn't merely an economic formulator of policy, but he was able to think about the world from the standpoint of the future. For example, there's Lyndon LaRouche's 50-year development policy for the Indian Pacific Oceans Basin. This was issued back in 1983. So he had projected forward from 1980s into the 2030s for India. But much earlier, back in 1975, Lyndon LaRouche had proposed what he called the International Development Bank. That is the proposal from that time, which was a replacement for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and their bankrupt policies, many of which were themselves the sort of policies based on the notion of depopulation, lowering the population of the planet. And of course, that has become a nearly hegemonic idea up until recently, when people have suddenly understood that the planet's in demographic crisis, and it's a crisis of underpopulation, not overpopulation. When, after the Soviet Union had fallen apart, Helga Zepp LaRouche was able to go to China. There was a development of a proposal called the Eurasian Land Bridge, or the New Silk Road. This is a process that wasn't merely that it came from our organization in any sense. It was already a set of ideas being discussed independently in China, which converged upon these ideas, and a dialogue began in the aftermath of 1991, from about 1993 to 96. The proposal that you're seeing there on your screen was actually the product of a discussion that had occurred at a June 1996 conference involving 37 nations in Beijing. And this was our response to that. Then, most recently, after the September 2013 announcement by Xi Jinping of his One Belt, One Road policy, the Executive Intelligence Review, which had been founded by Lyndon LaRouche back in 1974, produced the report, The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. This is these reports are the product of the character of economic study that came from the inspiration and the policies of Lyndon LaRouche. To just speak to the question of European security and development, during the period right after the fall of the wall, Lyndon LaRouche, from his jail cell, formulated a policy which was referred to at the time as the Paris-Vienna-Bonn Productive Triangle. Now, what this referred to is that in the area there seen on the left of your screen were about 100 million skilled workmen resided, and they were the most skilled workforce on Earth. And the idea they compared, we're comparing it to the Japan's industrial triangle, which was the other great, other than the United States, industrial power of the world at the time. And the notion was to use this productive triangle as a pivot into the East. And there, what happened was that we developed this idea of axes of development, which would basically emanate from these areas. Now you see here the cities, and if you take there Paris in the far left of your screen, then Berlin in the center, and Vienna down at the bottom there, the same triangle area. Think about that area as being pivoted into the east, into Poland, into Czechoslovakia, into Hungary, all of which had, and then of course Eastern Germany, all of which had been in the Warsaw Pact nations. So rather than the notion of NATO expanding eastward, the notion was to pivot this productive triangle eastward, including with a series of projects involving high-speed rail, nuclear power, and other such projects. If we can see the next, and this is a little bit of a busy slide, so we're not going to try to get into details of what this was, because of course it's also outdated at this point. But the relevant idea was that oil and gas pipelines and nuclear power, most importantly, high temperature gas cooled reactors, which are what those triangles that you're seeing on your screen, that's what that was to do. And so this, rather than the expansion of the so-called military alliance of NATO, which now apparently locates the Atlantic Ocean on the border of Russia, was the way to go. This is the notion and the idea that the proposal, the petition that is putting forward. So it's a new idea. It's not an idea about let's just do a mere reset of the present military alliances and discussions and so on, because that's completely a dead end. And presently, every proponent, from a Western nation at least, is talking about something which doesn't work. There is an alternative, and we'll probably be able to get in discussion about this. I want to stop here because there's both for time reasons and also because this can be covered in discussion, which is something that has been proposed by the China-Russia joint memorandum that came out at the beginning of this month, and really, by the way, is what caused more consternation in the transatlantic world, particularly at the City of London, than anything else. One would be naive not to believe or not to understand that the next shoe to drop around what we're looking at here is sanctions against China and the opening up of a front there. And once we go into these sorts of areas, all bets are off for the security and stability of any place on the planet. And so to get into the discussion and to try to shed some light on the actual dynamics as opposed to the delusional premise of some geopolitical struggle between Ukraine and Russia and so forth and so on, I've asked that two people join me, Paul Gallagher and Gerald Rose. So we're going to do Paul, who's the economics desk of EIR and is also editor of EIR, associate editor of the EIR. We're going to go to him first, and then we're going to go to Gerry, who, for those of you who may have heard us on Thursday night, discussed this from an historic perspective, taking Franklin Roosevelt's orientation toward post-war Europe and the world. But we're going to start first with Paul and then go to Gerry. So, Paul, you're on. Hold on, I think you're muted.
Yes, sorry, thanks. I think to start, we should look at what's actually happened in the last 24, 36 hours. It gives us a very clear sense of what is actually the purpose of the sides, so to speak, in this war, not including Ukraine. The sides being NATO, led by the UK, and the United States, led politically by the UK, led in terms of military muscle by the United States, and on the other hand, Russia, in its new over the last year, formally declared partnership, economic partnership in particular with China. As many people know, there was words about negotiation that came from the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, during a certain period of the day, late yesterday, and where these negotiations might be, and that the subject could be neutrality for Ukraine. If that negotiation were to go forward, which we should all wish that it does, then what would be under discussion would be just the same thing that was agreed already in 1991 regarding Ukraine, and actually put to a referendum of the people of Ukraine and adopted by them, that same neutrality. It would simply be going back to what was negotiated then, agreed upon then, and then ignored by the UK, the United States, the other major members of NATO ever since then. But Zelensky evidently was told, judging by what he has done since, he evidently was told, no, don't negotiate. Keep fighting. We are going to destroy Russia, absolutely destroy its economy. So that now sanctions are being discussed in the Biden administration, sanctions against the Russian central bank, essentially the attempt to exile Russia from the international financial system entirely, deny it of all sources of credit other than what it can raise from its own people and its own institutions. Those among the NATO members who were, in some cases, loudly opposing cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system, the international interbank messaging communication system, so that their banks could not rapidly process transactions at all. Those NATO members have abandoned their objections in the last 24 hours under, including some non-NATO members, under what has obviously been extreme pressure from the UK and the United States, so that Russia is now to be cut off from the SWIFT system, the interbank system. Sanctions against its central bank are to be, may very well be added. Germany is not only agreeing to suspend the operation of the pipeline, Nord Stream 2, but to do without Russian gas exports entirely, whatever that may mean for the freezing of its people over the next winter, in the way that people in Texas did over this past winter a year ago. Whatever this means for those allies, it is, the objective is now become extremely clear: the complete suppression of Russia's economy to the point of destruction, to the point of attempting to drive it back into the status of a third world country, and by doing so, placing of extreme pressure on China as to whether it will, in these financial and economic ways, stand behind Russia as it is being subjected to this third world treatment. And this is the purpose and has been the purpose of the generation of a war crisis between Russia and this really small country, not small in terms of really population or military capabilities, but small in terms of ability, economic ability in particular, and ability to deal with the UK, the United States, the other major European powers. So this country is being thrust not under the bus, but into the meat grinder of a war whose purpose is the destruction of the Russian economy. Now, we'd have to say why. The major economies of the transatlantic system, the United States, Germany, France, the UK in particular, if the UK can be called a major economy in any real sense, Italy, Spain, these economies over the period of the last 50 years have, and in particular since the late 1970s and during the 1980s, under the impact of the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system and the operation of a speculative casino known as the floating exchange rate system instead, these countries have abandoned productivity growth progressively over those decades to the point where it now is, in the United States, for example, below 1% per year, when during the period of the 30s to the 70s, productivity growth was in the range of 3 to 4% per year. It has now dropped below 1% in the United States. They've abandoned that. They've abandoned the real wages of their populations. The labor's share of the GDP of these countries has dropped from a little over 50% down to just about 40%, a huge drop over that half-century period in terms of what working people earn and receive in various ways as out of the production known as the GDP. Those countries have effectively abandoned any aggressive exploration of space, beginning really with the decision to merely build a space shuttle and cavort around in low Earth orbit instead of doing anything further in terms of actually exploring and developing bodies in the solar system. That was abandoned. They have abandoned the attempts to develop fusion power, cut those funding of those efforts down to the point where it is, where for decades already, it has been ridiculous to even say that these countries have programs to develop or attempt to develop thermonuclear fusion power. They've abandoned the production of new infrastructure. Everyone is familiar with this. I don't even have to describe it. They've dropped, very importantly, dropped the frontiers of machine tools. The United States and the European countries, for example, major European economies, for example, trail far behind Japan, far behind China in the production of machine tools. Germany is the only partial exception here. They've abandoned that. The United States is way down in 7th or 8th place in the production of machine tools and dropping further. They've dropped their investment in research and development. Federal research and research and development in the United States, for example, was 2% of GDP In the 1960s and 1970s, it's now 0.7%. And from just about exactly the point at which the Soviet Union dissolved in 1989 through 1991, from just that point, actually just before that point, the floating exchange rate casino system known as the World Monetary System of the United States and the major European countries, that monetary system has started to produce one financial crash after another since the abandonment of bank regulation in any serious sense in the UK first in 1986, then the United States when Alan Greenspan took over the Federal Reserve, the abandonment of regulation of banks so that these banks increasingly speculated and did not loan to an absurd point now. And debt bubbles were progressively blown up and then crashed, beginning with the 1987 stock market crash, and then the crashes of savings banks, and then of the debt of certain foreign countries, Brazil and Russia in the late 1980s, the dot-com bubble collapse, and then all that was punctuated by the 2008 global financial crash, which made clear just how serious this economic decline, collapse had become in the transatlantic countries. And then, as if anything could get worse, since the 2008 crash, there has simply been the buildup by the central banks, or with their money printing, of the most immense, unimaginably immense debt bubble that the world has ever seen, while GDP essentially stagnated. Just to give you one idea, the credit market debt in the world, that means government debt at all levels, business debt, household debt, those things all combined in the world were about $210 trillion in 2011. They are now in 2012. They are now 280 trillion. So that's a 1/3 increase, a 33% increase. GDP in that same period of time has gone from, for the world, has gone from about 76 trillion to about 81 trillion. That's an increase of well under 10% against a debt increase in a bubble which was already more than 3 times the size of world GDP. That has increased by 1/3. And that is not to speak of the hundreds and hundreds of trillions of dollars in financial derivatives piled on top of that debt bubble. The only reason that this bubble has not exploded completely in the period since the crash of 2008 is the same reason that it's been built up. That is, that the central banks led by the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, have printed tens and tens and tens of trillions of dollars equivalent in new currency and poured it into their major banks, their biggest banks only, in order to make those banks impervious to defaults, attempt to make the debt bubble itself impervious to defaults. And in the process, what they have succeeded in doing is they made all those big banks impervious to the possibility of lending any money. They don't lend it out. The loans outstanding in the U.S. banking system have not increased in any way now, not even nominally, for the past 3 years, while the banks themselves during that period of time have become almost 40% larger. The biggest banks become almost 40% larger. Their deposits have grown to that extent. Their loans, not at all. This is a system, a financial and monetary system, which long ago stopped functioning, at least 15 years, 16 years ago, stopped functioning and which is at the point of a crash of this immense, at least this immense 280 trillion everything bubble, and especially the corporate debt within it, which is the real hopelessly swelled part of that budget, with all the zombie corporations which cannot even pay the interest on their debt, let alone ever hope to pay the principal. And this is coming now. With this going on, the Wall Street, London, Washington are not unaware of this situation, not at all. They are aware that what they need to do is eliminate the competition. That is, the China of the Belt and Road Initiative, the competition among all of the 150 or more countries which have signed to that infrastructure initiative, seeing China as the country which has actually constructed new high technology infrastructure uniquely among major countries in the world over the last 20 years. Countries have signed up in order to enjoy credit for that purpose themselves, and you've had at the same time a number of high technology areas of export, in particular nuclear power, advanced nuclear power exports, in which Russia has also been offering the other countries the ability to rapidly increase the energy density and therefore the machine tool capabilities of their own economies. So that's the competition. It's now become very clear since February 4th, in particular with the announcement of effective economic and strategic partnership of China and Russia. The policy of Wall Street and London and Washington and Whitehall at this point is that that competition must be destroyed. What I described, I won't go back over it again, what I described that is happening right now with regard to the Russian economy and the pressure that's being placed upon China to see what it will do to support Russia in Russia's economy in this situation. That's the policy. That's the reason why this 30-year succession of expansions of NATO has gotten to the point where Russia has gone to war against it and has been put in a position of being increasingly forced to war against it. There's no question throughout this crisis that began in October that the policy of the Biden administration, and in particular of its clownish go before Bojo Johnson's administration in London, their policy has been to goad and goad and goad and to try to get Russia to actually go to war. What Ukraine has thought about all of this, the fact that they consistently said they did not think they were about to be invaded and so forth, all of the indications of Ukraine's sense that they were about to be sacrificed to this policy, that was by the by. And now you have this policy of crushing Russia entirely, its economy entirely. Now, leave aside that the much more spectacular wars, the much more disastrous wars of the last 20 years or so have all been initiated by the UK, the United States, and France, and carried out aggressively by the UK, the United States, and France. But we are told simply to call them mistakes. This actually goes all the way back to Vietnam with many people, but certainly we're only to consider the complete destruction of the country of Afghanistan as a mistake that we made. the complete and total destruction of Libya to the point where it has disintegrated into a highway for people trying to go across the Mediterranean into Europe, and has become just a battlefield of various militias and various armies. That's perhaps another mistake that we made. And then, of course, Iraq, that certainly might be thought by some people to be a mistake that we made. We make mistakes. We don't make wars. We don't commit crimes. We simply make mistakes that we get to regret a bit afterwards. But this war by Russia, this aggression, is so criminal, so evil, so incomprehensibly barbaric, and led by such an absolute demon that every method and every measure to completely destroy that country of Russia and drive it back into the third world status, every such measure is justified. Why, now we even have a certain movement among bar owners. I think this started in Canada, among bar owners to throw out the vodka, pour it out on the street, which must really strike everyone as an extremely brave and rational course of action in this crisis. That way, while the customers drink away their fears of the possibility that this will lead to a nuclear war between the United States, Russia, and perhaps China, while they drink away those fears, they can at the same time convince themselves that at least their host is taking some action. This is absurd. The action that needs to be taken is the immediate propagation of a policy to reverse the economic collapse that has been underway for decades, and to do that in a way which involves and benefits every country, all the developing countries, and every country, including the United States and Russia. We have only to consider that destroying the Russian economy entirely and driving it back into third world status was also the United States policy in the 1990s, when Bill Clinton was president, when the drunken Boris Yeltsin was president of Russia. It was also our policy, Britain's policy, NATO's policy in the 1990s. For what reason? Try to figure it out. The Western economies had abandoned development. They were looking for a policy which enabled them to loot and at the same time impose more austerity, especially on their own working populations. They found that ideally in the looting of Russia, to the point that Russia lost, at a certain point in the middle 90s, was losing 1 million population every year, not simply by immigration. More than half of that was by the surplus of deaths over births, over live births in the Russian population. It was a real genocide was occurring against the Russian population. So far back was it being driven. Russia had been a major producer of machine tools. One of I shouldn't say Russia, the Soviet Union, one of the leading producers of advanced machine tools in the world up to that point. That completely ceased. The production of machine tools in Russia dropped by more than 90%, from yearly 20,000 machine tools or parts thereof produced to less than 2,000, and stayed there throughout the 1990s. The same thing is being done in the last 3 years. The chips, the last 3 years, not in the last few months, but the last 3 years, the same thing has been done to Russia. The advanced semiconductor chips required for some of the most advanced machine tools simply are not sold to Russia. There haven't been sanctions against this until now, but these sanctions won't make any difference because already the machine tool manufacturers in Taiwan, where the biggest ones are, in the United States, in Europe, in Germany, in Japan, wouldn't sell them. So that policy, in effect, has been going on now for 30 years. This is a policy which was adopted then without any shadow of war, as Putin always says. It was adopted against us in the 1990s when we appeared to be your best friend, when we wanted to jointly fight terrorism, when we wanted, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, the policy of destroying our economy was adopted then, so it's now adopted now. And now the pretext is the issue of Ukraine, which is not an issue of Ukraine at all, but is imposing great, and has been imposing great suffering on the people of Ukraine for years now. That's another country whose population has dropped from 48 million. We just have had an interview for EIR this week that Mike Billington did with a very, very knowledgeable published author on Ukraine. He is a professor in the UK and also at a Moscow university, who said that the figures being used for Ukraine's population now are essentially false. They account all the Ukrainians who have moved since 2014 into Western European countries and are working at various contract and gigs and so on and so forth, that the actual population of Ukraine has dropped by 8 million since 2014, from 48 million to 40 million or thereabouts. And 6 million Ukrainians are now effectively resident workers, Gastarbeiter, as they used to be called in Germany, resident workers in other countries in Europe. The standard of living and the level of GDP of Ukraine are lower than they were 30 years ago. So this is a country which itself has been suffering from this policy for a very long time, and has been used in order to apply that policy of economic destruction, they hope, London and Wall Street hope, to Russia, and to begin to apply it to China as well. That will allow them, if they can do it, to then allow a lot of the unpayable debt in this immense bubble to crash. And they will do that provided that they have an austerity policy and one on a world scale, which gives them additional loot. That policy was called initially by them the Great Reset, by the British elite, Prince Charles, and the City of London banking elite called it the Great Reset. But the more that was discussed, the more obvious it was that that was not such a great name to brood about, so they called it instead the Green Deal or the Green New Deal. That is precisely the austerity policy, which is to be the basis, and is being made the basis of a huge new green finance bubble in order to allow the Wall Street and London banks to skate, with the help of their central banks, to skate through this crash. But they must, to be in a position to do that, they must eliminate Russia as a competitor and begin the process with regard to China. That is what is going on at this point. The only thing that you should be wishing for and working for is that an entirely new policy be advanced, a new economic policy be advanced as the basis for a new strategic architecture. There is no neutrality for Ukraine, no strategic architecture, no solution strategically for Europe without a completely new economic policy that begins and ends effectively with LaRouche's 4 laws. It begins by breaking up the biggest banks in the United States and in Western Europe, those banks centered in London and on Wall Street, which are the real centers of this disease of austerity and potential economic collapse. From that standpoint, then it becomes a policy of the machine tool capabilities and the infrastructure needs of these 150 or more countries around the world, which have hopefully signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative of China, of meeting those new infrastructure needs, especially in healthcare, health and hospitals, but meeting the very, very broad infrastructure needs and the need for a machine tool capability to industrialize. We lack that ourselves. When we destroyed the Russian machine tool capability, that was right at the time that the CAD-CAM revolution, computer-assisted design, computer-assisted manufacture in machine tools was being introduced, especially in Germany and Japan. Russia missed out on that because it was subjected to a policy of looting. The United States missed out on that as well because it simply wasn't interested and didn't bother to invest. So the United States began to slide down the ladder of machine tool powers at that point as well. But this is an issue for the development of all of the countries, particularly the developing countries in the world, most particularly including Russia. And that was what Lyndon LaRouche aimed for in what Dennis referred to before. I won't go over it again. His idea in the Strategic Defense Initiative, at the point when as LaRouche had foreseen, the Soviet Union was collapsing. That machine tool revolution, especially what he called the laser industrial revolution, had to spread in the United States and Russia, and from them to the developing sector and to China, which is part of the developing sector at that time. And that spread of that laser industrial revolution was the broad purpose of Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative. And he put it forth at a time when a new strategic architecture in Europe was desperately needed, but it needed that economic basis. It didn't take place, and instead we had the steady, blundering expansion of NATO, which Dennis showed you in the maps before, which have led to the current extraordinarily dangerous crisis, which could go into a wider war as a result of what's being done on the sanctions side and the rushing of U.S. and other troops into the Eastern European countries bordering on the Soviet Union, and the rushing of weapons, including anti-aircraft weapons being rushed by the NATO powers into Ukraine at this point, and into those other Eastern European countries, inviting the war to spread. So thanks. That's what I've got for you now.
Yeah, we figured. Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul. And if you're just joining us, you're listening to the LaRouche Organization webcast, Precipice or Turning Point, Can a New Security and Development Architecture Replace NATO? On Thursday night, we had a conversation with many of our organizers, supporters, and others, in which we tried to give people not just the, quote, historic context, that's too trivial a way, but a completely different platform from which to think about these developments. And Gerry Rose, who was with us then, led that discussion. So I asked that Gerry come on today and in commenting, hearing what we're talking about here, make comments. Also, I'll just indicate that we also have former National Security Agency technician Kirk Wiebe with us, who will be commenting on the entirety when we come to the conclusion. So, Gerry, please.
Yes. There really has never been a security architecture which is not based upon development. There's no way, as Paul indicated, the negative aspect of it, there is no way that you could maintain peace, which frankly is a very profound concept, but there's no way you could maintain it without development. And in one of the most stunning revelations in a book written by Franklin Roosevelt's own son, in the first person, called As He Saw It, and it's about as his father, Franklin Roosevelt, saw it. And what was absolutely essential to the idea of peace and the idea of the post-war order that must come in. And on Thursday night, I had developed a docudrama, which is a work in progress, but we had a reading of the discussion of Franklin and his son, Elliot. And many who heard it, and I recommend that people do listen to the Thursday night discussion, had known of it because we have written about it before, but to actually hear, and I use a truncated version of it, to actually hear in the words of Franklin Roosevelt himself, telling his son that imperialism, colonialism means war. And Franklin Roosevelt had lived through 2 world wars. He was the Undersecretary of Navy in the First World War, and he was the President of the United States in the Second World War. And the book itself, As He Saw It, is one of the only that I know of, and I've read a lot, of the most candid, direct discussion of what Franklin Roosevelt actually thought. And he warns his son, and this is somewhat stunning, he warns his son that if we do not end colonial rule, colonial slavery, everywhere in the world, as he said in his famous For Freedom speech, everywhere in the world, then he said, your son in 15 years will be at war. He said, Elliot, I'm talking about war. If we do not end this colonial rule, we will have war. And that forecast came true within hours of his death. There have been 25 wars from 1945 to I have it to 2019. There's probably a couple more. All of them based on the rejection of Franklin Roosevelt's Bretton Woods proposal, the full Bretton Woods proposal, not what we ended up with. Some of it was effective. But what Roosevelt had projected, with the help of the Soviet Union and the help of China, and the United States leading the effort after the war, and this was all discussed at the Bretton Woods meeting, that the infrastructure needs, particularly focused on what was called the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was one of the most productive programs of the whole of the Depression, and took 20 to 30 million people out of poverty in the poorest area of our country. And this was to be emulated the world over. In fact, the Indians at Bretton Woods, even though they were under British colonial rule, had proposed a worldwide TVA authority. This TVA, Richie Freeman has documented it, was the basis for an enormous economic expansion in Brazil. Funded how? Through their national bank, not a central bank, in which Roosevelt, Jesse Jones had arranged with Roosevelt and others. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which went way beyond Wall Street. You couldn't get a loan out of Wall Street. So Roosevelt created his own authority and would float bonds, which the Treasury would buy. And those bonds were earmarked for industrial and infrastructural development. And Richie Freeman does a very effective job of documenting what happened in Brazil with these kinds of loans. Every nation on the planet was to go to national banking. Get rid of Wall Street. Get rid of London. They hated Roosevelt. In fact, in 1936, in his campaign, every single newspaper run by Wall Street and London attacked Roosevelt. In 1936, after he brings the United States out of the worst crisis in our history, every single newspaper attacked him. And in 1936, he said, "Wall Street hates me." Isn't that grand? And won the most overwhelming election in history. We have to do that again. Paul indicated what these guys are up to. We have to do that again. And at Bretton Woods, these proposals with China, both the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang, with Roosevelt's support, were going to get development loans for infrastructure. Russia, Soviet Union at the time, was going to get development loans. Stalin had made it quite clear that he did not want to export revolution. He wanted to work with Franklin Roosevelt because he was a man you could trust. He's a man you could work with. He's a man who was committed to the future of his country and every country in the world. As he said, everywhere in the world. That was what was to ensue had Franklin Roosevelt lived. Part of it occurred in terms of a stable monetary system, a certain amount of credit. But that was the vision for the world. What happened? The second Roosevelt died, Harriman, the Dulles brothers, who, frankly, Allen Dulles, the day Yalta was actually convened, was working with the SS, the Nazi SS, to get a separate peace, to actually use the Nazi apparatus in Eastern Europe, to use the Nazi apparatus throughout what was later called Gladio. They worked with the Nazis. You know, this is not the first time Wall Street and London had worked with the Nazis. In fact, and this is totally documented, so I'm not saying anything strange here. They funded the Nazi Party. When they almost went bankrupt in 1932, Prescott Bush, a Brown Brothers Harriman, moved the money into the coffers of the Nazi Party. Brown Brothers Harriman worked, and other law firms worked with the Nazis to create their war machine. Montague Norman and the British Bank funded, besides the Nazi Party, funded and made sure that Hjalmar Schacht, the Nazi finance minister, was backed up. So the second Roosevelt died, these guys moved in. Now it didn't end, because there was a number of people who were prepared to fight them. Kennedy being one, Eisenhower being another. I'm not going to go through that story. But we are now at the point where that vision of security and development, there is no opposition. There can be no security without development. And the legacy and actual people who knew Roosevelt, many of them had grouped around the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And Lyndon LaRouche, in a sense, understood Roosevelt better than Roosevelt understood Roosevelt. And that mission is now come to the point of decision. We have candidates who can do the job. In Helga Zepp LaRouche and the LaRouche organization, many in the world are grouping. And as Paul said, we don't have a choice. We have to go back to the ways that we used to think about mankind, about the future, and establish that now through LaRouche's 4 laws. We can do it, but it has to be now.
Well, thank you, Gerry. There's a lot that we want to talk about today. We're getting questions in, and we're going to try to get to all of these questions. But we also have a few other things we're going to be using to prompt some responses to some of the questions so that we can sort of avoid having to ask the same question several times. But if you've just joined us, we are in the middle of our webcast, Precipice or Turning Point, Can a New Security and Development Architecture Replace NATO? And what we're talking about in specific is a petition that the Schiller Institute has issued that we're trying to have circulated and recirculated and discussed so that it enters into the discussion process, not sort of from the side, but from the top. That's a situation that we find ourselves in, and it's an important one that the country finds itself in, the world finds itself in. At this point, I want to ask that Kirk Wiebe, retired senior analyst for the United States National Security Agency, join us. Kirk was with us last night in a previous discussion and had observations that I thought were really important to bring into today, and then see how Paul and Gerry respond to what Kirk says, and otherwise just get the conversation going. And we will get to questions just after that. So for those of you who have them, or others who haven't asked them yet, just go ahead. You'll get the information at the bottom of your screen as to where you can get the questions into. So Kirk, glad to see you again so soon.
Hey, thank you, Dennis. My goodness, what a wonderful couple of dissertations, I will call them, by both Paul and Gerry in actually providing a summary analysis of history and behaviors all working against development, all working against even the hope of security. I wrote down a sentence before we began today's talk, Dennis, and just to let Gerry know, here's what I wrote. Security includes economic well-being. Indeed, without economic well-being, security is only an unattainable hope. And so we are thinking alike, at least in parallel, and I think it's obvious. And with Paul's description of the realities of the behavior of the banking system and the political system, I mean, all of these systems that govern men's lives have become corrupt. And that's the point I had hoped to make last Thursday night, night before last, and I will make again. I want to allude to, and I'm going to paraphrase Samuel Adams, one of the great founders of our constitutional republic here in the United States. Adams said this: no set of laws, no constitution can govern a society whose manners are universally corrupt. And I would suggest to you here today, including the audience, that all of the institutions that are governing our lives, virtually all of them, have corrupted themselves over time. And as corruption infects these bodies, such as the United Nations, such as NATO, such as the central banks and the global financial cabal, I will call it a cabal, because it has become, we must give it a negative nuance in terms of what it's raising havoc with global relationships, and it needs to be exposed. So I would say this: no matter what platform we devise to capture Lyndon LaRouche's 4 precepts and move the whole task forward, we must have people involved in that. Leading it and staffing it must be people of integrity, people of honor, people who have credibility. In other words, we must have a group that fends off and is somewhat protected from the evils of hidden agendas and political considerations. We must dedicate ourselves to a global state that we want to achieve, in which competitive advantage we capitalize on. We need to begin with the basics, look at the resources of each country, list the challenges, and then work out the strategy how to capitalize on strengths and how to address weaknesses. And as we do that, we will indeed make huge steps forward. But we need the ethics to make it happen, or these platforms, these new organizations to do this work will simply fall prey, as so many have in the past, to evil. And that's my comment.
Well, maybe what we'll do, let me just ask first for the responses from the two of you, and just know that maybe one of the things we can do is to play the original discussion that was leaked onto YouTube back in 2014 involving Victoria Nuland and another United States official, Pyatt, I think was his name, about the government that they were about to put into power in Ukraine by overthrowing the government that was still in power. Some people are aware of this conversation. A lot of people never saw the conversation or don't know about the conversation. But that's occurred about 15 days before that government was actually overthrown. It was occurring during the time of the Maidan. So I'll just let people know that we have that, and we can, show that at some point, because that might be appropriate as a way of illustrating what you're referring to. But if Gerry, you have anything, or Paul, to say at this point.
Paul, you want to go first?
I did. I had to unmute. Kirk, thanks very much for that. I was really struck by, you have to have the ethics. It's how I understood you. The ethics to make this work, and this is a terrible problem. We need people to come forward and to move forward, to take action as responsible citizens, both of their country and of the world at this point. Start from the obvious necessity that negotiations start immediately between Russia and Ukraine, but act to try to demand, to try to push, to try to force those negotiations to involve larger questions. Because when we talked about the Treaty of Westphalia, that is a treaty which provided it's considered to have provided the basis for the nation states in the whole modern period, the last 600 years, and for the principle of non-interference by powers into the affairs of states which they have no business interfering into. But the treaty itself, those are more formal aspects. The treaty itself was based on an appeal, as Helga LaRouche has said recently several times, an appeal to love, that is to agape, to the love of humanity. And that on that basis, the atrocities, whatever they have been, must be put aside. And I was just trying to maybe be a little bit abrasive in terms of making clear we have committed, the UK, the United States, the NATO alliance, have committed a lot of atrocities. They have not been the only ones in the world. But you have to move forward and demand that those atrocities be put aside, whatever they have been, and that they be replaced with an idea of what is the benefit of all, what is the benefit of the other country, the other people, what is the benefit of all. And as I was trying to indicate, starting from Russia itself, and which in certain ways could be considered a leading nuclear power and at the same time having some characteristics of a still developing country, the starting there in the world as a whole, how can the actions of restoring the regulation of banks and essentially the compulsion of banks to lend money, to intermediate deposits and lend money, actions to send credit for the development of new infrastructure of the most needed kinds, like the Tennessee Valley Authority that Gerry was referring to, and on. These things require the ethics of being willing to look at this as a citizen of your country, a patriot, and a citizen of the world at the same time, and say, what would be the best to come out of this for the people and nations of the world? That's what our statement, our petition, the Schiller Institute's petition, that's what it tries to put forward. What would be the best for the peoples and nations of the world at this point? You shouldn't really be trying to think of anything else, because that's the basis for peace. And ethics does not, in this situation, does not allow for irrational anger at one country or another.
Okay, Gerry, anything?
Yes, thank you so much, Kurt. I was very struck and I think people should reflect on it, because in the Thursday night talk, I had read Sukarno's statement to the Bandung conference, because the developing sector was savaged by Wall Street in London, savaged. The second Roosevelt died, they brought back colonialism to Indochina. The French, the Dutch attempted to destroy Indonesia. And they fought back. Vietnamese fought back. Do you know that Ho Chi Minh wanted to work with the United States? He was one of the few leaders who opposed the Japanese. But what we did to Vietnam, when we could have had development there. So what happened at Bandung was a call, as Martin Luther King did. So those who have the least must give the leadership the moral courage, have the moral courage to do what is right and good. And I tell you, we are at a break point, a branch point. Paul, I thought, did a very effective job of presenting that. They cannot, their system is going to blow. What they're doing to people all over the world, and they cannot, no matter what they do, that's what they're going to do unless there's a change. And therefore, every person who stands with us for the future as part of a combination of the 150 nations, remember, there's 150 nations who have rejected the Wall Street, London paradigm. China, Russia, the majority of the world, the majority of people in this country. You think they trust this government? You think they trust the news media? You think they trust anyone? They don't. And now it's time for people to become part of an international strategic movement so that they can see the future for themselves as part of this movement, a part of Lyndon LaRouche's scientific discoveries. So I think we are at a moment of great opportunity and of great danger, and that's how we had the American Revolution. The British came in. They said, you're going to swallow it. You're going to bail us out. British East India Company, you're going to buy our tea. You're going to buy what we tell you at the prices we tell you. And those who want to lead will kill. Well, that's over. And I think we have to have the courage. And as Kurt says, they tried everything to break the LaRouche movement. They've tried everything. They tried everything to break Putin. They didn't break him. They tried everything to break China. They didn't break them. So as part of an international strategic movement based on the principles that Paul said, we cannot just go around saying, you're bad, we're good. No. We have to actually present. And I think with Diane's campaign and a bunch of other campaigns against Schumer and these corrupt Wall Street types, I think the young people of this country are ready for a change. I think a lot of people are ready for a change. So I think the potentials are enormous.
Well, I think one of the things we might do for the audience, because of course, people are being bombarded by all kinds of things. And of course, what's being done is to try to get the coward's reflex going in the United States that people are familiar with from the time of the McCarthy era, or other things, or for that matter, January 6th, where you're supposed to now start to say things are true that you know are not true. But in fact, if somebody stands up, particularly right now, and tells the truth, something different is likely to occur. Now, we're just going to show you, because a lot of people never saw this. And this is something that I'll just set it up. BBC News back 8 years ago, February 7th, ran a transcript of a conversation that happened between Victoria Nuland, who was sort of the special operative on the part of the United States and CIA, so other agencies, but the special operative assigned to Ukraine, and Gerald Pyatt, who was the U.S. Senior diplomat, I think, Assistant Secretary. Nuland was Assistant Secretary of State, and Pyatt was the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. And so what happened was that they were being bugged, and their conversation was, how we say, overheard, and the British then revealed that conversation. Now, the conversation didn't take place on February 7th. It took place before February 7th. February 22nd, the government was overthrown. And what had happened that had preceded this, just so everybody understands the relationship between economics and security, shall we say, is that on November 21st of 2013, the elected government had decided that it was going to not go with the European Union, or even necessarily Eurasian Economic Union, which was the correlate Russian-based economic union. But they were saying, why do we have to choose between these things? What is the problem? Why can't we actually have some form of economic cooperation that involves both of these blocs? And particularly, of course, this was something that was in their interest because of their 1991 agreement, in which they were supposed to be neutral. Ukraine was supposed to be neutral. What happened was that a process began the night that the refusal to join the European Union came in, and it happened in the Maidan in the area there, and began in November and continued through February. So this is a transcript of the conversation, but it will be punctuated by the actual voices. I'm going to try to bring this up right now.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Convoke and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, I just think Cleach going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting, and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a three-way, 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I think that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them, where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point, so I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych did that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly side up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks.
So let me break this down a little bit so everybody knows who the actors are, who the players are. Yanukovych was the president of the country. There had been an election that had been internationally recognized. Everybody said it was fair, free, all that. What's happening is that the United States doesn't like the fact that Yanukovych said we're not going into the European Union. So, and Pyatt is not clear why he even did that, but he did it. So now what they're doing is they're deciding, okay, this is the government we want. And for anybody who's ever read or referred to John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you know what's really being discussed here. So they're deciding on who the government is going to be, which we are all going to hear about later on after it, quote, comes into power because of the people's revolt in the street against oppression. So who those people are that they're referring to is Vitaly Klitschko. Right? That's one of the opposition leaders. Oleg Tyanibok, he's with the right sector. Well, he's actually for Svoboda Party, but he's a right-wing sort of, shall we say, questionable pro-Nazi element. I'll put it like that. And then you have Yatsenyuk, who will become the president. So what they're doing is they're trying to jockey this. Now, usually Klitschko is the top dog. And the problem is they can't bring him into the government with Yatsenyuk also. So they got to figure out to keep him out and then at the same time make them all feel like they're in it. So that's what the big three thing is. It's Yatsenyuk and Klitschko and Tyanibok, right? That's the big three. And that's who they have to have this conversation. So anyway, all of this is being manipulated puppet string wise by Victoria Nuland. And of course, the question is, which Pyatt asked the end is, hey, well, are we going to need Biden on this? Well, we may need him for an attaboy kind of thing. Yeah. But that's the idea. The UN piece is if we can get the UN to also endorse this, then we don't need the EU. So all that talk you've been hearing the last weeks about we're doing nothing in Ukraine without the Ukrainians and we're doing nothing without the European allies and all this other stuff. Well, this is their actual view. And that's also why you heard in the last days, Zelensky kept saying, hey, we don't see no Russian troops coming. And Washington was saying, oh, Russian troops are coming. And the defense minister of Ukraine saying, I don't see no Russian troops coming. And the Americans are saying, oh, the Russians are coming. The Russians are saying, we're not coming. And the people say, oh, you are. And so what you have is this configuration in which one sees revealed what one does often not see revealed. By the way, just for purposes of reference, people can also take a look at two documentaries that Oliver Stone did. One is called Revealing Ukraine, and the other one I think is called Ukraine on Fire. Just they're out there, and I think you can get them on Netflix or whatever to get more of the thorough background and to see a lot more than anything we can show you here or we have available to us. So having played that, I want to see if there are any responses that any of you gentlemen have to what you just saw and heard. Okay, Kirk.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful example of what's wrong with us. It is just illustrative of the hubris, the arrogance, the self-appointment, the self-licking ice cream cone I mentioned Thursday night. This should be in every classroom as a perfect example for how not to be if true Republican democracy is to exist in the world. And we mean what we say about self-determination when we talk about nation states and representative governments. Yeah.
Okay. Anything, Paul or Gerry? If not, we'll go to questions.
Let's go to questions.
It's pretty clear, right?
I think I'm muted.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Now we can hear you.
Oh, I was just going to say that sounded like the same Joe Biden, who was the author of the plan to divide Iraq into 3 countries.
Yeah.
If people will remember that particular great idea that he had.
Oh, yeah, right.
So many of these, and he pushed it very hard. I think he was already chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so he thought he had weight to throw around. But we have so many of these things that we're now charging that Russia is doing to the sovereignty of countries that we have repeatedly done. We cannot do this kind of thing. We can't talk about dividing countries into 3 parts and similar things, because otherwise you might as well then start talking about dividing Ukraine into 3 parts, because it has ethnic differences from one part to another. The point is, well, we've already made it. Development at the frontiers of technology and with the means of industrialization being provided by high quality machine tools and new infrastructure and new means of power, electric power, and development, like the TVAs, Tennessee Valley Authority developments all over the world. That's what we must come to stand for as a country. It could start right now. So that's all I'll say about that.
Okay. So before I go to the couple of questions we have, I think Jose found us a picture of Ole Tianibuk under the opposition. This is one of the people that they weren't sure about bringing him into the government, and I think that was I think we get the idea. Okay, so first question is from Ruben. Ruben asked this: are the events we are seeing in Ukraine the latest move by globalists to set up a global digital currency? For example, what the Economist magazine cover for January 9th of 1988 discussed. Is there a correlation between this? They're asking about the global digital currency, and they're saying, now, is there any correlation between that and the past 2 years of COVID restrictions? Now, Paul, I think you should take this up. That is whatever part of that question you'd like to.
I don't know about the COVID restrictions necessarily, but good digging on the part of Ruben. It's an important point. The central bank digital currencies are just one means. It's one that's been a lot of emphasis placed on studying it among these banks, but it's just one means of the central banks grabbing control of spending, of fiscal policy and spending away from governments and merging it essentially into one with the monetary policy of of printing money, of creating currency, and supposedly with the ghost of what used to be called interest rate policy. Now that interest rate policy died and went to hell, and now the only thing that remains of it is zero, which is kind of ghost. That's the rates have to be zero all the time. But this is one means by which the central banks wanted and do want to have control of a combination of money printing and government spending. And to a significant extent, it appears during the coronavirus pandemic they have gotten it, but it's important to understand, and they've gotten it without going to central bank digital currencies, at least not yet. It doesn't require that, but it's what you say is true. That's what they want. It appears they may have gotten it because of the coronavirus pandemic and all of the tremendous amount of money printing combined with spending, especially the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Fed. They've practically become one body, swapping leaders back and forth and meeting every day and so on. But actually that started before the coronavirus pandemic. It started with the crisis in the U.S. interbank lending market in September, the middle of September, 16th and 17th of September, 2019. The first signal that this immense bubble of debt that I discussed earlier was starting to break apart, and that another crash was on the horizon. That led to an immediate adoption of helicopter money by the Federal Reserve through what we call the repo markets, the repo lending market, and the substitution of the Federal Reserve for significant functions of the banking system, in addition to spending functions of the government. So that's really when this kicked off. And I know you weren't asking this particularly, but that is roughly the point, fall of 2019, when the hyperinflationary impulse appeared, when the asset inflation, which had been going on for the whole previous decade, stocks, bonds, constantly going up in value, when that asset inflation started to burst out of those markets and into commodity inflation and then into consumer product inflation. That's really the point at which it started.
Okay, now we have several different questions because people have been circulating the petition, and they wanted that there'll be a discussion about the 4 laws, because that's the sort of the conclusion of the petition. The first part around security is pretty straightforward in terms of getting that discussion. But of course, people to whom they're circulating the petition don't know what those laws are, and they wanted to be more discussion of that. It's sort of that kind of summarizes 3 questions that we have here. So if now we have a graphic, by the way, Paul, if you want to use it, Jose, can you just put that up for a minute, which is the first of the laws. I don't know if that helps you, Paul, but if you could get us started on this, and maybe Gerry can pick up.
Yeah, this is very, well, now I can't see it, but this is very obvious.
Great.
There we go. This is very obvious right now. I referred to this briefly earlier. You got a whole U.S. banking system, which if you go back 30 years, the loans and the deposits in the banking system were just about exactly equal, within 1%. If you go back 20 years to 2000, no, a little less, 2007, 15 years, they were still within 1% or 2. The loans outstanding by the banks and their deposits were just about exactly equal. If you go to 2017, all of a sudden, only loans were only equal to 80% of deposits. Now, December 2021, loans are only equal to 59% of deposits. And this is all down to the biggest banks, the 12 Wall Street giants and regional majors, all those banks where half of their deposit base is not used for lending at all, but entirely for speculation and for playing the repo games, and that is why there is no increase in lending for 3 years in the U.S. banking system. It's also why, if the Federal Reserve tries raising interest rates to contain inflation, it won't have the slightest impact on inflation. You can only do that if there's healthy lending going on by the banking system. There ain't. So these monsters have to be broken up so that they can participate. If we're creating federal credit and participating with the development banks of other countries, like particularly the Chinese development banks that are lending to the Belt and Road Initiative projects, if we're also participating with those with our own credit, then how are American companies going to take part in this global construction of a new infrastructure? They're going to have to borrow money. They have to borrow money from their banks in order to get a contract, take part in any of this. And if their banks won't lend, then you're stuck in the situation where the national bank or the government has to lend every cent to everybody. Something that FDR had to tackle as well with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So that's the that's the step, so to speak, taking out the garbage before you start to eat. That's the essential first step, is to break those banks up. Then they can collaborate with a national credit institution, a Hamiltonian national bank or a nationalized Federal Reserve Bank, in order to create the credit and build on a global scale and develop. I keep coming back to these machine tools, where the United States and the European countries, other than Germany and Italy, are so far behind, and which are essential to the completion of any major new infrastructure development. You have to have those modern machine tools. In Russia, they'll be desperate for them because they import all the ones they use. Being unable to get the essential components in order to build them, they import them. So this is the essential first. It's what LaRouche called his first law, although he didn't by any means want them to be considered as, well, you do this 1 year and then you wait several years and do the second thing. No, they're all one policy.
Okay. Gerry, any comment?
Yeah, Lynn would always say, look, we saw how we got out of the last depression. The first thing Franklin Roosevelt did was close down every bank in the country within 2 hours of office, and audited the books and saw what was real, what was not, what could be reorganized, how to recapitalize these things so that you could get the economy moving. That was the first thing he did. And that was he said, we have nothing to fear so much as fear itself. So he acted. He said, action, and plenty of it. And then to get things moving, he set up the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend for mortgages. If Wall Street wasn't going to lend, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was going to lend. And Wall Street refused to lend. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation not only issued at the end something in the order of tens of billions, today that would be hundreds of billions, to get the economy moving again, the machine tool sector, the TVA, whatever had to be done. Then he set up other authorities like the CCC, in which the young people had to be employed and employable. So he had them build roads, he had them do reconstruction in the countryside, he had them build schools, help paint schools. If the principle was if a person was healthy and they wanted to work, there had to be a job, a productive job waiting for them. And he wasn't going to beg the Federal Reserve. He wasn't going to beg these Wall Street bankers. He created the authority and the power to do it. And that's the idea of central bank, of national banking, which he envisioned for every nation in the world, that they didn't have to go begging, that if they had development projects and they were worthy, the credit would be figured out how to do it, how to put their people to work. And this created massive markets for American machine tools and American goods. That's what his idea was. That in fact is the idea that Lynn put forward. So that the driver, and as Paul has been stressing, the science driver is critical to create great leaps in productivity, particularly with respect to fusion energy, the kind of leaps that would make. So we're going to have to break the power of Wall Street. We're going to have to break the power of London. And the only way you can do that is by nations coordinating their actions together to regulate, to break up and regulate that the economy in terms of for producing and discovery. There's a whole, Lynn was amazing on that. And the only real fundamental thing that Lynn always insisted upon is that the future generation be better than the last one. That's how you knew your economy was working. That they had more opportunity, more access to science, more access to beautiful music and beauty, and that they would be more productive. If you did that, things were working. And if you didn't do that, it wasn't working. And these 4 laws are a way of, and the only way, and in fact, the way that it actually worked to get us out of the Depression and to finally fight the Nazis. And had Roosevelt survived, we would have defeated them forever.
Okay, we have basically 2 questions I think I'm going to combine, and they'll be the basis for essentially, now I got another question. Now they started to pop in. All right, so excuse me, I just got a third one in, and it may not be the same. Well, actually, here's what I'll do. I'll pose, since we have 3 questions, I'm going to pose each of them to each of you. And then as we conclude those questions, I'd also ask you to give sort of summary remarks. So, Kirk, here's the one for you. And actually, I don't know who sent this, but as a former intelligence person, how would it be best to break the current block on propaganda vis-a-vis Russia, with things like the Nuland conversation explicitly working? Like the Nuland conversation showing us explicitly working with Nazi leaders like Tiani book, I can't seem to break through the line that Nazis in Ukraine is Russian disinformation. Any suggestion on that? So that's your question. I'll try quickly. As a former intelligence person, how would it be best for us to break through current block on propaganda? And obviously what he said on the Nazi question. So here's a second question, and we'll go to either Paul or Gerry, one of you. This is from Kynan. This is, thank you everyone for your comments. With the fog of war now cast over Ukraine, it has been very difficult to decipher what is truthful and what is disinformation in respect to the situation on the ground. Ukrainian military sources claim that there have been Russian bombings in cities, civilian casualties, and many other things. The Russians, on the other hand, dispute many of these claims And this lack of clarity is causing many fights between people as to what is actually going on. I think the only way to discuss the strategic danger with people in a productive way is to actually get past all of these reports and discuss a new security and development architecture, which brings both parties to collaborate on improving the interest of the other. What other ways do you think we can organize people who don't have a clear sense of the situation and favor one perspective, whether it's in favor of NATO or Russia, over viewing it from a higher standpoint? So, which of you would like to take that one? I just want to, because I have to assign the final one.
Yeah, well, give it to Paul.
Okay, Paul gets that one. All right, Paul gets that one. All right.
No, I get the prize.
Yeah, but you get. All right, now let's see. And your question, if I can find it here, is, hold on, just okay. I have it. Similar, actually. Given the fact that the misinformation and propaganda is running high in the situation around Ukraine, is it worth trying to debunk every lie that's being propagated right now? How can you cut through the emotions that people have and their clouded judgment and try to get them to think on a higher level? Okay, so those are basically the questions. All right, so who'd like to start? Kirk, you start. Very good.
Well, on the issue of intelligence, there are a couple of things, a couple of background issues to consider. First of all elements of intelligence are under the executive branch of government. Congress has no intelligence arm, none. The third branch of government, the judiciary, does not have any intelligence arm, if you will. So we have to look to ways, if we want to separate propaganda from intelligence fact, we have to encourage ways that cause the intelligence community, the people managing it, and this goes up to the White House, straight to the White House, and on down into the various agencies, that they stay out of the propaganda business. Now, it's one thing to understand propaganda, that's okay, but not to employ it. We have had numerous instances in the past couple of decades or more where the intelligence agency involved, and that includes components within the United States military, because each military branch has its own tactical intelligence assets, where commanders have distorted intelligence, edited it, if you will, in order to make the news more agreeable in terms of what perhaps the White House or the Joint Chiefs of Staff or someone wants to hear, as opposed to the reality of any given situation. This is dangerous beyond belief. Can you imagine facts being distorted to please someone's idea of what good news is, as opposed to reality? Can lead to huge miscalculations in terms of intentions of potential enemies, and could actually lead to war. So it's a great question. It is not an easy solution, but one of the solutions is to give the legislative branch, this is part of our checks and balances, true oversight capability. And what I mean by that is today, when NSA reports to Congress, it's basically a PowerPoint presentation and a paper and a handshake. There's no, if you remember Gorbachev, trust but verify in his dialogue with President Reagan. Trust but verify. We need that dynamic in the United States government. Congress needs to empower itself with the capability to truly monitor what NSA is doing, what CIA is doing, what the FBI is doing. It has an intelligence branch. The Drug Enforcement Agency, it has an intelligence branch. Department of Homeland Security. We've got so many intelligence branches. I sometimes wonder who knows what's real and what's not. In any case, the bottom line is we need to beef up true oversight, make it real, clear people that belong to Congress, give them a classified area, what we call a secret compartmented information facility, a SCIF, in which they can conduct and have access to the most sensitive operations of these agencies to see what's really going on. Until we have that kind of checks and balances, it's a joke. And it will always be purely political or mostly political, and very liable to be slanted that way. So that's really the way forward if we're going to do something about it.
Okay, Paul?
Well, Kynan's basic question, I think, was how do you deal with the emotional effect on people of serious war propaganda, which they're being hit with again now. Not only people in this country, not only people on the NATO side here. But what are you going to do? There have been so many wars, just considering this century, 22 years, there have been so many wars in which a major power or a group of major powers have declared aggressive war against a small country. So many times, over and over again, in which emotional appeals have been made to hate that country. Are you going to limit yourself to say, I only want to think about the one that's going on right now? And you know what you're probably saying when you say that is, I'm scared to death about what might happen here. This could be a nuclear war. I only want to think about this one. I don't want to think about anything else. I want an enemy, and I want their side and our side. In that case, you completely disable yourself as a citizen, as a thinker, as a human being, because you're nothing but a bunch of raw emotions being ginned up to hate a person, a leader, a country. You're useless. You have to make yourself consider what has been going wrong. Time after time after time, a major country armed to the teeth commits an aggressive war against a small country. How can this be stopped? What's the basis for stopping it? Yes, start with the current one in the sense of get negotiations going on in the current one, which can expand to get at the bigger causes. But what is it that can actually make this stop? And it's not sufficient for people like Americans do to say, well, we don't want to be involved. You know, they say we shouldn't be involved over there. Well, believe me, the war party, the congressional war hawks and so forth, they don't care whether you say you don't want to be involved. They can use the media to get you involved emotionally on the hate level in a matter of 2 days. And you know, anything you may have said before that about whether you want to be involved or not, they could care less. You have to get yourself to, I would say, think on a higher level, but really this level is not so high, to simply think of what the benefits would be from finding a way in which these wars could stop taking place. in which you could have a strategic architecture which would give guarantees to countries that they would not be invaded and destroyed. And it's not by having a bunch of other countries come in and help them fight and have the war spread from country to country to country. It's by dedicating a policy in the opposite direction, in the direction of economic and industrial buildup and recovery, and making of those nations the industrialized nations that they wish to be. So what we've put forward in this petition is simply, look, if you agree that we should get from here to there, where we could be acting to the benefit of these countries and not involving them in wars, then here's our proposed way to get from here to there. If you agree, sign the petition. This has got to be done right now. It is, I think, a matter of not of arguing about whether given quote unquote facts in the media are true or false. You could almost bet that at this point, probably almost all of them are false. But what I've just said is a truth that can be grasped by anyone.
Okay, Gerry?
I would just add one thing to what Paul and Kurt said. Look, there are no formulas. You have to have valid, ongoing intelligence you can count on so that you even know the terrain you're acting in. And therefore, the website, the TLO website, because you're in a very rapidly evolving situation, you have to immerse yourself in reality so that you're not drawn pillar to post. You also have to engage yourself and you have to see yourself and prepare yourself to lead. That's what a republic is. And you need the intelligence and the knowledge to do that. And therefore, the Executive Intelligence Review, the Alert Service in particular, if you have the wherewithal, and the immerse yourself in the TLO site so that you're constantly radiating and get involved in the campaigns, because you're constantly radiating the situation as it's actually evolving beyond the propaganda. And then people will turn to you and say, what's actually going on here? That doesn't, I think what Paul said and what Kurt said is critical. That's just an add-on, but a critical add-on when you're in a rapidly evolving situation.
All right. Well, I want to thank Kirk Wiebe and Gerry Rose and Paul Gallagher for being with us. We are going to put up the petition again so everybody can see it, because we want you all to go to the website and to begin to circulate it, both for signatures as well as for debate and discussion. And the idea of this, convoke an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations, is that this exact thing can be done by you and by us as a group of people mobilized to do it. Now, as we go to the conclusion right now, I just want to bring up something that's been stated a few times, but I want to just make this people aware of this. We always, as you know, try to make the point about British intelligence, because our point is that the United States is presently being run by the British Empire of the mind. This is something that we believe, and those of us who were with Lyndon LaRouche from back in 1974 think we documented the fact that the intelligence agencies of the United States themselves have been dominated since the period, particularly after the Kennedy assassination, by a different conception, not just of government, but a different conception of man. Lyndon LaRouche, in the video that we showed you, described the concept of scientific inquiry, referencing specifically the Russian-Ukrainian scientist, Vladimir Vernadsky, and his concept of the biosphere, and how that concept is the basis for understanding that human development is not unnatural, but it is part of what's called the noosphere, the development by means of creative reason of the biosphere as a whole, that mankind develops the biosphere in the same way that the oceans and the atmosphere are themselves a result of life. They were not things that were found on the planet before life was here. So too, there are intellectual products called science and technology, inventions and so on, that are natural in the environment, because otherwise we couldn't even be here. That is what mankind does has to be, in that sense, natural. Of course, there's deliberation. Of course, there's choice. But that doesn't mean that what we are doing is artificial. Matter of fact, you will see the impact of that if, in fact, the world ends up going to nuclear war, because we will destroy the entire planet. And that will demonstrate that the processes that go on that are the product of the misuse, in this case, of scientific principles, have a direct impact on the biosphere as a whole. The whole planet may still be here, we won't be here, but the fact of the matter is that it will alter clearly the character of the biosphere. There's an article that appeared a few days ago called "If Russia Invades Ukraine, Sanction China." And the subtitle is "Putin has found an economic lifeline in Beijing that only Washington can destroy." What we're dealing with, therefore, in looking at this, is a group of people whose view is that the economic development that we have seen from China and the economic development that Russia would like to become involved in, together with the other 150 nations that have become part already of the Belt and Road Initiative, that's the target. That the thing called the Great Reset is targeting physical economic development. That the 8 billion people on the planet should not be here on the planet, and that the planet should be severely reduced. And as those who follow and are paying any attention know, the planet is actually presently undergoing a crisis in population, of underpopulation. That is, in the next 50 years, we will see this. Virtually every continent will see a decrease of population except Africa, and those racists among the establishment don't intend for that to happen. China's population, for example, could decline by as much as half. India will be either at the same level or slightly below. The entirety of Europe, it goes down to a third of the present population. That's also true of the United States outside of immigration. And so what that represents is that if the fundamental parameter of economic development is whether or not human life expectancy is extended, people become more healthy, and it's possible for people to be at the same time on a higher economic level, which is the way in which the technological developments and scientific developments of the Italian Renaissance vectored humanity, that being the exact principle that Prince Charles, Al Gore, and others target. They say that's the evil. But that is the great question. And that is the actual dispute presently going on in the human race today. To just return for a moment to that article, it said, faced with the threat of further Western sanctions against Russia if it invades Ukraine, Russian President Putin has been seeking shelter in China. On February 4th, the opening day of the Beijing Winter Olympics, Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping announced a new strategic partnership between their two countries. A joint statement described the Chinese-Russian relationship as a friendship with, quote, no forbidden areas of cooperation. And it goes on, and you can get the article yourself and read it. I just wanted to reference this as we go to our conclusion, because that arrangement that has been established between China and Russia is actually the product of the work of many people over many decades. It could be and should be an arrangement between the United States, India, China, and Russia, because that's what Lyndon LaRouche had designed and talked about very much, particularly in the 1990s. Into 2001, 2002 in specific, because the notion was that this combination of nations, all of which in one way or the other have been subjugated to British imperial forces. particularly, of course, the United States in the case of the American Revolution, the Chinese in the case of the Opium Wars. India obviously was subjugated by the British, with tens of millions actually killed at different points in India's history by British policies. And in a different way, Russia's alliance with the United States from the time of the inception of the United States, through the League of Armed Neutrality of Catherine the Great, Russia's support of the United States during the Lincoln administration against Britain and France, and the joint joint mission of the United States and Russia in fighting fascism, that those four countries represent together the means for ending the British imperial rule, which is the central fact of true politics today. It's not at all what you wish to think it is. You wish to believe that the United States is the great imperial power. No. The great imperial power is Great Britain, the Commonwealth, not because merely of its financial holdings and the fact of its extent, which is the greatest of any so-called empire in the world, but because of the cultural domination of the United States, or at least the intent to have the United States represent itself as being what it never was. The United States has never been an imperial power. That's why it does so badly whenever it tries to do that. The United States is a sovereign, independent, Republican nation state whose Constitution and whose Declaration of Independence require that economic development is the basis for the governing and self-governing of this country. Unfortunately, because of the fact that Americans have abandoned their history and they don't know names like Henry Charles Carey or Matthew Carey or Erasmus Passion Smith or Wharton Barker or Friedrich List, they know none of those names. So they don't know that the thing called the American system, which is the actual way in which this country was built, which came out of Alexander Hamilton's revolution in America based on his work with Ben Franklin being the primary student in the world of the scientist and economist Gottfried Leibniz. That's the history, not John Locke, not Adam Smith, not free enterprise, all that stuff that they teach you and people repeat, who are well-meaning people at places like Prager universities, some of these other locations, right? From the so-called right-wing, free enterprise, rugged individualist American standpoint. That stuff is killing us because it all comes from the British Empire of the mind. Americans don't know themselves. They don't know what they are. They don't know why they are what they are. What we have to do, and what the LaRouche organization is devoted to doing, and we've done this in various history books that we've written and are available from us, we've done it in other ways in Executive Intelligence Review, is to bring America back to its senses, but not from the standpoint of America as the great hegemon. No, we think that this idea of the Treaty of Westphalia, we think that this idea of economic progress as a whole, through this new security and development architecture, this allows for a discussion in which people who have great achievements in culture, science, and technology from all over the world can collaborate, can combine themselves for the good of humanity as a whole. And that can save us, and only that will save us. So as we go to our conclusion, we're asking that everybody, after this broadcast, get the petition, not just in terms of getting it to sign, but look at it and study it, get it, begin to discuss it. Do the same thing that our ancestors did with common sense when Tom Paine wrote it back in 1775. Start circulating this and taking it apart. It's only a couple of pages. So you take it apart and make sure you understand it and get other people to understand it, because all over the world, this document is in the interest of all people. And therefore, if people all over the world study it and begin to use it, it's possible, just possible, that the human race can see itself turning around, heading toward a future of durable survival through economic development. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank everybody for being with us today. Work with us around the petition, and we'll see you again here next week, assuming that we're all smart enough to not blow ourselves up in a thermonuclear conflict, which would only happen because we have decided to lose the moral fitness to survive.